The sun hung low on the horizon, a bruised orange ball peeking through the ashen sky, casting long shadows over the ruins of Pine Ridge. My boots sank into the dry, blackened earth as I stood at the town's edge. The air was thick with the pungent scent of smoke, the acrid bite of burned wood still lingering as though the fire hadn't quite finished its work. Ashes danced in the wind, swirling around me like forgotten memories, reminders of everything lost. I didn't look at the wreckage, at the twisted metal, splintered wood, and crumbling brick. I couldn't. My eyes saw faces instead, the faces of people I had failed, my team, my friends. The fire had taken them all. I could still hear their screams, feel the desperate cries for help clawing at my skin. I had been too slow, too damn slow. Now I walked through a ghost town, a broken place that mirrored the cracks in my own soul. My boots crunched on the charred earth as I moved, each step echoing in the hollow silence that hung over the town. Pine Ridge was nothing but a memory now. The forest beyond, though, still stood, dark, silent, and watching. That's where it had all started. The fire hadn't spread like a regular wildfire. It had spread too quickly, too unnaturally. There was something more to it, something that didn't belong. Something ancient. And as I stood in the heart of what was left of the town, I could feel it, crawling up my spine, like a cold hand brushing my skin. A voice broke through my thoughts, and I turned to see Jake Turner approaching. His face was grim, his eyes scanning the ruins, but there was something else in them, something I knew all too well. Guilt. He had been there, seen what I had seen. The fire had taken everything from us, but we had both survived, together. But the weight of my failure still hung between us, heavy and suffocating. "I'm fine," I managed to rasp, my voice rough from the smoke still hanging in the air. I didn't want to face the truth, not now, not with him, not with the town's broken face staring back at us. Jake didn't press. He knew better. He had seen the destruction, felt the same weight I carried. We walked side by side, our footsteps swallowed by the silence that enveloped the ruins. "It's strange," Jake murmured after a while, his voice laced with something I couldn't name. "This place, it doesn't feel right. I keep thinking we're not alone." I didn't answer right away, my eyes drawn to the dark line of trees at the edge of the town. The forest loomed like a beast, its gnarled branches reaching out, beckoning us into the darkness. But there was something wrong with it. Something older, something buried deep in the earth beneath it, waiting to be woken. "The fire," I said softly, barely above a whisper. It wasn't like any wildfire I've ever seen before. It spread too quickly, too intensely. Something triggered it, something unnatural. Jake's brow furrowed, his gaze fixed on the forest. "You think it wasn't just the dry conditions, the wind?" I shook my head slowly, the memory of the heat, the inferno, still vivid in my mind. It hadn't been like anything natural. The flames had felt alive, feeding on something. Something in the woods. Something we couldn't see. It was like the fire was feeding on something in the woods. Jake stopped walking then, his eyes narrowing, his expression hardening. He looked back at me, uncertainty mixing with a flicker of fear. "Maybe you're right, but we don't have the answers. Not yet." His words felt like a finality hanging in the air between us, a warning we couldn't ignore. The forest was still, but I could feel it. Something was waiting in the shadows. It had been here long before the fire. It had never left. Then, a cold wind swept through the ruins, and with it came a whisper, too faint to understand at first. But as it grew clearer, my blood ran cold. It was my name. Cassie Blake. I froze. My heart stuttered in my chest. The voice wasn't familiar, but it knew me. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, the weight of something ancient pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. What the hell was that? Jake's voice cracked with alarm as he stepped closer, his face pale. I couldn't answer. My thoughts raced, panic clawing at my insides. The forest wasn't just watching us, it was calling to me. The fire had been the first step, the spark that had awakened something buried deep within the earth. Something that had known me even before the flames. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling, despite every effort to stay calm. I turned away from the forest, but the whispers followed, louder now, echoing in my ears. And in the distance, deep in the heart of the forest, a faint ember glowed, like a watchful eye waiting in the dark. I didn't need to look back to know we weren't alone anymore. The sun was almost gone, sinking low beneath the horizon, casting long, slanted shadows across Pine Ridge. The warmth of the day lingered in the air, but there was a bite to the evening breeze, as though the town itself had sensed the darkness creeping in. Jake and I walked down the worn path toward Mrs. Grant's house, a place as ancient as the town. The house stood ahead, squat and weathered by time and isolation. Its sagging porch creaked under the weight of years, and behind the lace curtains in the windows, faint flickers of movement suggested life still stirred within, or perhaps death, waiting. The house seemed to hold its breath as we approached, as if it were expecting us, anticipating our arrival. Before we could even knock, the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Grant in the doorway. Her frail form stood against the darkness, her face a map of time, every wrinkle etched with memories, secrets, and stories long buried. Her sharp eyes locked onto me with a knowing gaze, one that chilled my bones. "You've come," she said, her voice soft but firm, like the rustling of leaves in the autumn wind. "I knew you would." I nodded, stepping inside the dim hallway, the smell of lavender and dust hanging in the air, as if the house itself was alive with the weight of forgotten history. The shelves, lined with yellowed, cracked books, filled the space with an overwhelming sense of age. Books that had lived through things I couldn't even imagine. The room itself felt heavy, the walls seemingly holding the weight of memories long past, memories that might not have wanted to be remembered. "Come sit," Mrs. Grant said, her voice a gentle command, guiding me toward an armchair by the fireplace. I sat, my skin prickling, but Jake remained by the door, his eyes scanning the room, his unease palpable. There was something in the air, something invisible but suffocating. Mrs. Grant moved slowly, her joints creaking, as she poured tea from a steaming teapot. The steam rose in twisting tendrils, like smoke from a fire that had long since burned out. She handed me a cup, the warmth a fleeting comfort, but the unease gnawed at me, relentless and unyielding. I had to know, I had to understand. "You've been feeling it, haven't you?" Mrs. Grant asked, her voice sharp as if she were reading my very thoughts. "The forest calls to you. It whispers in the wind, doesn't it?" I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. "I hear something." Voices, faint at first but growing louder. They know your name," she interrupted softly, her voice trembling. "The spirits of the forest are awake, Cassie. They've always been there, beneath the roots, beneath the earth. But now they've been roused. And they are angry." Jake stepped forward, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "Angry? Mrs. Grant, are you saying the fire was—" He faltered, the words too much to say, too absurd to be true. "The fire was no accident," Mrs. Grant replied, her voice steady, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the room. And it was not just a wildfire, it was a reckoning. She walked over to the fireplace, her frail hands trembling as she gestured to the faded portraits on the mantel. Pictures of families long gone, their faces frozen in time. The stories behind them were ones I could feel but couldn't fully grasp. This town has always been tied to the forest, to the spirits that dwell within it, Mrs. Grant continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. A long time ago, before Pine Ridge was settled, there was a cult. People who worshipped fire, believing the flames held the key to the spirits' favor. They thought they could control the fire spirits, appease them with their rituals. They believed fire could give them power, immortality even. My pulse quickened, the words stirring something deep inside me. But it didn't work, did it? I asked, the question hanging in the air like a quiet accusation. No, she said softly, almost mournfully. The fire spirits were never meant to be controlled. They were never meant to be worshipped. The cult's failure was the beginning of their wrath. The spirits didn't forgive them. And now, after all these years, after all this time of silence, the fire has awakened them once more. And this time, they will not be so easily quelled. I leaned forward, my breath shallow. What do they want from us? Why now? Why, after all these years? Her eyes grew distant, as if seeing something far beyond the room. They want what they've always wanted, she murmured. They want to burn, they want to consume. The fire that rages within them is not just heat, it's hunger, and it will not stop until it has taken everything, until the forest is once again in their grip. The fire is their voice, their will, their power. Jake shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking nervously to the door. And what do we do about it? How do we stop it? Mrs. Grant turned to us, her face as pale as the moonlight spilling through the windows. There is no stopping it now. The spirits will not be appeased. The fire has done its work, and they will feed on the ashes. They will take what is left and make it their own. You, Cassie Blake, are bound to them now. You were drawn here for a reason. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, bound? She looked me in the eyes, and in that moment I felt as though I were being pulled into something ancient and cold, something that had been waiting beneath the surface of the earth for centuries. You failed them once, didn't you? Mrs. Grant asked, her voice soft but heavy. You failed to save your team. The fire took them. And now the spirits have found you. They know your guilt. They know your regret. You have nothing left but to face them. But beware. The silence in the room deepened, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on us. The forest is not the only thing you should fear. The spirits are not kind, and those who seek to banish them often find that the price is higher than they could have imagined. A chill ran down my spine, and Jake took a cautious step back. His voice trembled. How do we stop it, then? There's only one way, Mrs. Grant said, her voice barely a whisper now, as though speaking it aloud might summon something. You must sacrifice what is most precious to you. Only then can the spirits be bound, can the fire be extinguished, but the cost is more than anyone can bear. My mind raced. Was I truly trapped by my past failures? Could the spirits be my only way out? Or was there something darker waiting to be uncovered? Mrs. Grant's eyes met mine, somber and heavy with warning. The forest will call to you, she said, and when it does, you must choose. There is no turning back. The air had turned colder as I stepped beyond the shattered boundary of Pine Ridge, leaving the smoldering ruins behind. The town, once full of life, now felt like a distant dream, its edges fraying, its existence slipping away in the wake of the fire. Hours had passed since Mrs. Grant's warning, But her words still echoed in my mind, relentless and unyielding, as if they were embedded in the walls of my skull. The forest loomed ahead, a dark, twisted mass of trees that stretched toward the sky like skeletal hands. The silence felt suffocating, oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, watching me. The weight of it pressed down on my chest, pulling at me from the earth beneath my feet, as if the ground itself was aware of my presence. Behind me, I could hear Jake's hesitation. His body was tense, his voice cracking with uncertainty as he muttered, "Cassie, this is insane. We don't even know what we're looking for. Mrs. Grant's just a—" "She's not wrong," I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. I didn't mean to sound like that, but the truth was gnawing at me, relentless and ugly. I can feel it, Jake. Something's out there, something the fire woke up. Jake narrowed his eyes but didn't speak. His instincts still clung to logic, to reason. But I knew better. There are things in this world you can't explain, things that defy science, that crawl beneath the skin of reality. Things you can only feel deep in your bones. With a last, lingering look at Jake, I pressed forward, my footsteps firm and purposeful. The air around me was thick with the forest's silence. The trees stood like twisted sentinels, scarred by the fire's wrath, but still tall, still thriving in the darkness. The wind whispered through the leaves, not quite wind, but a faint rasping murmur, like words caught in the underbrush, just out of reach. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the world around me seemed to shrink. The sky above became a dim canopy, thick with branches, blocking out the light. The air was damp with the scent of wet earth, mingling with the acrid tang of the recent fire. Each breath I took felt heavy, as though I were inhaling the very soul of the forest itself, its ancient power, its rage, its sorrow. The path beneath my feet was uneven, littered with jagged rocks and brittle branches. My boots crunched over the ground, the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. My hand brushed against the blackened bark of a tree, and I shivered involuntarily. The touch was wrong, cold, dead, but still somehow clinging to life. And then I saw it. A figure, faint and barely visible in the distance, standing at the edge of the trees. Its form was tall, skeletal, flickering like smoke in the low light. My heart pounded in my chest, and instinctively I stepped back, but the figure remained motionless. I blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by the shadows as if it had never been there at all. A cold wind swept through the clearing, lifting the ashes from the ground. For a moment, I thought I saw something else. Something darker, something alive, curling in the shadows at the base of the trees. It was as if the forest itself had eyes, watching me with unblinking intensity. Suddenly, the air shifted. A whisper, low and slithering, curled around my mind, threading through my thoughts like a forgotten memory. "Cassie Blake." I froze. The voice was clear now, unmistakable, and it filled my chest with a cold, creeping dread. My body tensed, and I looked over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow. Just the quiet hum of the forest, the rustle of leaves that were still too perfectly still. "Join us." My blood ran cold. I swallowed hard, but the voice gripped me like a hand around my throat, squeezing, pulling. I could feel it in my chest, something ancient, something vast and unfathomable, pressing against my heart. My fingers tingled, my legs felt heavy like lead. I stumbled, catching myself against a nearby tree. I was alone out here, alone with whatever the fire had awakened, and it was calling me. Another voice, clearer now, echoed from the shadows. "You failed them." My stomach twisted. The guilt, the weight of it, rose up again, thick and suffocating. I could hear the screams of my team in my mind, their faces filled with fear and confusion as the fire overtook them. I had been too slow, too weak. I hadn't been able to save them. The whisper continued, relentless, cruel. You cannot escape what you've done, Cassie Blake. The forest knows you. We know you. My legs buckled beneath me and I sank to my knees, gasping for breath. My hands pressed against the ground, my fingers digging into the earth, trying to ground myself in something real. But the soil beneath me trembled, and the air thickened, as if the very earth was alive, pulsing with the heartbeat of the forest. I tried to rise, but the voices pressed harder now, louder, more insistent. And then, through the fog of my panic, I saw it. A dark shape moving in the distance, flickering in and out of sight. It wasn't just one figure. There were many, shadowy, indistinct, but moving with unnerving fluidity. They were closing in, silently, as if they had been waiting for me. Join us. My breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. I couldn't think. I couldn't reason. I had to get out. I had to. A figure stepped into the clearing ahead of me. My heart stopped. It wasn't a person. It was something older, something not of this world. Its face was a mask of smoke and shadow, its form shifting like a mirage. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed a sickly amber, burning with the same intensity as the flames that had ravaged the town. You are here to pay the price. I tried to stand, tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air around me crackled with heat, even though the forest was cold, damp. The ground trembled again, and the whispering voices surged into a terrible chorus. Guttural, primal, urging me to join them, to surrender. And then, from the edge of my vision, I saw Jake. He was running toward me, his face twisted with fear. But his feet slowed, as though the forest itself were pulling him deeper, dragging him into its grasp. "Cassie!" he shouted, but his voice was distant, fading into the wind and the cacophony of voices that threatened to drown us both. The ground gave way beneath me. I fell, the earth opening up, swallowing me whole. And then, there was nothing but darkness. My senses snapped back to life with a jolt, and the first thing I noticed was the cold. It wrapped around me like a suffocating cloak, freezing my skin, making my bones ache. I gasped, and my breath misted in the air, the cold biting into me deeper than it should. It was dark, darker than it should have been, even for a forest at night. The trees loomed like silent giants, their twisted branches stretching upward, their outlines sharp and unnatural against the inky sky. There was no moon, no stars, just the heavy, oppressive blackness of the forest, broken only by faint, flickering embers that glowed like dying fireflies. My chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, my pulse quickening as I scrambled to my feet. My legs felt unsteady, like they were made of wood, as though the earth beneath me was shifting, pulling me deeper into the forest's grasp. Where was Jake? I turned around, but there was no sign of him. A thick mist had settled over the ground, swirling around my feet, its tendrils creeping up my calves like fingers. Panic surged in my chest. "Jake!" I called, my voice trembling, but the forest swallowed my words, devouring them before they could even escape. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, like the very air was pressing down on me, urging me to stay still. And then it came again, the whispers. Soft at first, like the rustling of dead leaves, but then louder, more insistent. "Join us, Cassie Blake." My heart skipped a beat. The voice was cold and ancient, like it came from the very depths of the earth. And it wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, a weight, a hunger. I tried to take another step, but the ground beneath me shifted again, and I stumbled. When my hands hit the ground, they scraped against something rough, something jagged, stone, cold and slick. I looked down, my breath catching in my throat. The altar. It was the same one I had seen earlier, the one in the clearing. But now it was different. The air around it crackled with dark, malevolent energy. The stone surface was scorched, burned beyond recognition, but there was still something pulsing beneath it, a faint, ominous glow that sent a shiver racing down my spine. A low, guttural growl rose from the shadows, and I froze, my body stiff with terror. Something was coming. I could feel it in the air, in the vibrations of the earth beneath me. The ground trembled, and the trees creaked and groaned, as though the forest itself was alive, stretching, reaching for me. And then they emerged. They weren't human, not really. They were shadows, flickering in and out of the dim light, their forms shifting like smoke from a dying fire. Their faces were pale, hollowed-out masks of bone and ash, their eyes glowing a sickly amber, burning with the same hunger as the flames. They were the spirits of the forest, awakened by the fire, hungry for vengeance. They moved silently, gliding toward me with unnatural grace, their forms stretching and warping as they came closer. There was no sound to their footsteps, but I could feel their presence like a cold wind brushing against my skin, like a breath on the back of my neck. "You failed them, Cassie Blake." The voice was louder now, a chorus of whispers rising from the depths of the forest, surrounding me, suffocating me. The spirits stepped closer, their glowing eyes fixed on me, their bodies an indistinct blur of shadow and flame. They weren't just spirits, they were the fire itself, born of the flames, fueled by anger and wrath. "You." My voice was shaky, hoarse from the fear clawing at my throat. "You want me to join you, don't you?" They didn't respond with words, but the air around me thickened, the temperature dropping even further, until it felt like I was standing at the edge of a frozen hell. The ground beneath me cracked, and the faintest scent of burning wood filled the air, curling around me like a suffocating fog. They had been waiting for me. I could feel their presence now, deeper than the cold. They weren't just spirits. They were a force, an elemental power bound to the earth itself, to the fire that had once consumed it. And they were angry, so angry. "You're the ones," I whispered, understanding settling in like a cold stone in my gut. "You woke the fire. You are the fire." The spirits drew closer, their hollow faces twisted in something like a smile. But it wasn't a smile, it was a promise of pain, of suffering, of endless burning. "Join us," the voice repeated, insistent, suffocating. "You are one with the fire, Cassie Blake. You always have been." My heart thundered in my chest as the shadows surrounded me, their forms shifting and expanding, pressing in on all sides, blocking out the light. I could barely see them anymore, could only feel them, feel their cold presence wrapping around me like chains. And then, as if the weight of their gaze was too much to bear, I heard it. The faintest crackle, a whisper of fire, like a distant flame licking at the edges of my mind. The spirits didn't just speak, they controlled the fire. They fed on it, and it fed on them, a cycle of destruction that had never been broken. I staggered backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I reached for something to hold on to, but the ground was slick beneath my feet, and the altar loomed in front of me, a symbol of the ritual I had disturbed. "You cannot escape your fate," the spirits whispered, their voices rising in a crescendo of fury. "You cannot escape the fire." "No," I gasped, my body shaking with terror. "I won't join you." My mind raced, my fingers tightening around the stone of the altar, as though I could break free of their grip. The fire that burned in my memory, the flames that had taken everything, seemed to pulse with life around me, growing stronger, feeding on my fear. "Join us," or burn with us. The ground shook beneath me again, but this time it wasn't just the tremor of the earth, it was the fire, spreading, curling from the stones of the altar, licking at my feet, wrapping around my ankles. The spirits were pulling me in, urging me to succumb to the flames, to be consumed by the hunger that had driven them for centuries. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't run, couldn't fight them, not with force. I had to sacrifice something to bind them, to put out the fire that raged within them. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cool metal of my fireman's badge. I had failed before, but this time I would choose differently. I would make the sacrifice. I had to. The badge glinted in the low light, its weight heavy in my palm, and I raised it above my head. With a cry of pain, I hurled it toward the altar, watching as it spiraled through the air, glowing briefly before sinking into the flames. The fire surged higher, its heat intensifying, but something shifted in the air. The spirits recoiled, their faces twisting in fury, but the flames began to retreat, as if something had broken their hold. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, the weight of my sacrifice settling in my chest like lead. But I had done it. I had bound them. The spirits screamed, their voices rising in fury, but the fire began to die down, the embers slowly fading, leaving only the echo of their rage behind. I was alone again, the forest silent, save for the distant crackle of a single ember, glowing faintly in the dark. And yet, as I stood, my chest tight with the weight of the sacrifice, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fire was not fully gone. The spirits might be bound for now, but the forest would always remember. And somewhere, in the depths of the trees, the embers still burned. My breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale sharp and frantic, my chest rising and falling violently. I could feel the tremor in my body, not from the cold, but from the weight of what I had just done. I had done it. I had bound the spirits, forced them back into the earth from which they had sprung, the fire snuffed out by the price I had paid. But even as the last embers of the altar flickered and died, something gnawed at me, something deep and unsettling. The forest was quiet now, too quiet. The oppressive silence that had once hung heavy in the air lifted, but it was replaced by an eerie stillness, as though the very world around me was holding its breath, waiting for something. I glanced down at the ground, where I had thrown my fireman's badge, watching as the final embers sputtered and faded. The stone of the altar was cold now, its jagged edges dull in the dim light, but there was something else in the air, a lingering heat, a pulse beneath the earth that I could still feel in my bones. The whispers, though softer now, were not gone. They still drifted on the wind, insistent, like a memory just out of reach. "Join us." My pulse quickened, and I turned around, expecting to see the spirits, those shadowy figures with glowing eyes looming behind me. But there was nothing. The forest was still, its trees as silent and unmoving as the grave. "Join us." The voice came again. But this time it wasn't just a whisper, it was a command, a demand. And it didn't come from the forest, it came from somewhere deeper, from within me, from the very core of my soul, my hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white against the blackened ground. The flames had been quelled, but the fire still burned inside me. The fire that had taken everything from me. The fire that had claimed my team. The fire that I had failed to stop. "Join us, Cassie Blake." The voice was louder now, a chorus of rage, a symphony of flames rising from the depths of the earth, from the very roots of the forest. My head spun, my vision blurred as I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to run, I wanted to escape, but there was no escape from this. There never had been. The fire had never been just a force of nature. It had been a force of vengeance, bound to the land, to the spirits, and now it was bound to me. I stumbled toward the altar, the ground beneath my feet quaking with terrible energy. The trees around me seemed to shift, their branches reaching toward me with unnatural speed. Their shadows grew darker, more oppressive. I was being drawn in, pulled toward something I didn't understand, something that was calling me, beckoning me to surrender. The altar glowed again, faintly, as though it had been waiting for me to return. My hand reached out, trembling, as though I were no longer in control of my own movements. I had done this once before, sacrificed the badge, but now it wasn't enough. The spirits weren't done with me, not yet. And then, as if the forest itself had finally spoken its truth, I knew what had to happen. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me like a storm. The fire, the spirits, the altar, none of it would stop unless I gave more. Much more. The price that had been paid before was nothing compared to what was required now. I was the fire. I had been since the moment I failed my team. The flame had burned in me ever since. The guilt, the shame, the loss. And now it was time for the final payment. My heart thundered in my chest as I slowly turned toward the forest, toward the dark, silent trees that seemed to watch me with a hunger of their own. I knew what had to be done. I was the last sacrifice. The air around me grew heavier, colder. The spirits were closing in, their presence thickening the shadows around me. They weren't just whispering anymore. They were calling to me, pleading with me, promising me release, promising me peace. But I knew what that peace would cost. It would cost me everything. My hand trembled as I reached into my pocket, feeling the smooth metal of the fireman's badge there again. But it wasn't the badge that had called me. It was the fire that had never left. I dropped to my knees before the altar, the ground slick with the remnants of the forest's ashes. I closed my eyes not to pray, but to accept my fate. Join us. The voice was louder now, ringing in my ears. It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was a roar, a firestorm. I lifted my head, staring into the heart of the forest, the shadows now swirling around me like a storm of smoke and flame. The spirits were everywhere now, their forms shifting and distorting with every blink. They had waited for me, watched me, and now they would claim me as their own. I stood, my heart beating wildly in my chest, my hand raised above my head, the fireman's badge clenched tightly in my fist. I had failed once before, but now, this was the final reckoning. There would be no more mistakes, no more hesitation. The fire was calling me home. I hurled the badge into the air, watching as it spiraled upward, glowing faintly in the growing darkness. Time slowed. The badge hung in the air, spinning as the shadows closed in around me. And then, just as the badge reached the peak of its flight, the spirits surged forward, their cries a deafening roar. In that instant, the world erupted into flame. The fire engulfed me, sweeping over my body, searing my skin, but it didn't burn, it didn't consume me. Instead, it wrapped me in its embrace, pulling me into its endless, fiery depths. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the inferno, swallowed by the flames that roared around me. For a moment, I felt myself fading, felt my body dissolving into the fire, becoming one with the spirits. But then, through the smoke and the heat, I heard it. "Thank you, Cassie Blake." The voice was soft, almost tender, and for a fleeting moment I felt peace. True, lasting peace. The fire was gone. The spirits were bound. The forest was still. But as the flames began to die down, I realized I was not alone. The forest still watched, the embers still burned. And in the distance, far beyond the trees, something shifted, a faint glow on the horizon, like a promise that the fire would never truly go out.